All right, let me go ahead and get started. My name is Jean Fox, and I am the co-chair of the User Experience Community Practice, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our 2020 Virtual Government UX Summit. We've got a really great program this year, and I'm excited to hear from our colleagues in government from across the country and at all levels. I want to thank everyone who made this possible, including my co-chair, Wendy Stengel, who was there every step of the way. I want to thank the staff at GSA who provided really outstanding logistical support for this event. I want to thank everyone who submitted proposals. We got a lot of really great ones. And I want to thank the review team who helped to plan our fantastic program today. That was a difficult process. Thank you to all the presenters who took the time to work on their presentations and share their experience with us, and to all the chairs who are facilitating the sessions this year. And thank you to all of our people who are attending the session today. This is why we're doing it, and I'm excited that we've got such great interest in the summit this year. We've got a great program with 2 sessions a day, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of this week. Don't forget, you have to register for each of the sessions separately because we've got separate links for each one. The summit this year has been organized by the Digitalgov and the User Experience Community Practice. The mission of Digitalgov is to transform how government learns, builds, delivers, and measures digital services in the 21st century. They do that by providing people in the federal government with the tools, methods, practices, and policy guidance they need to deliver effective and accessible digital services. As part of their mission, Digitalgov supports the User Experience Community Practice. Our community provides resources to help those doing user experience work at all levels of the US government, and is open to anyone with an interest in UX and a government email address. Take a look in the chat box because there'll be information on a link to our website so you can find out more about joining our group. And you can find out information about other communities as well because they have a number that are relevant to UX work. And finally, a couple of logistics before we get started. We're planning to have the videos of the presentation available in a couple of weeks, and the slides for the presentations as well, probably along the same timeline, but we'll keep you posted. We'll send information to the community. At the end of the event, you'll see a link to a survey. Please take time to fill it out. It will help us give you even better events in the future. And keep your eye on the chat because there'll be other informational links in the chat as well. All the attendees will be muted today, so please direct all your questions to the chat, whether they're questions for the presenters or technical issues. We'll have people monitoring that for both kinds of comments. And as a final reminder, this event is being recorded. So thank you very much to everybody who made this possible. And I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne, who will be the chair for this session.
Jean, so our first presenter is John Pull, and John's library career spans 28 years, but only 2 institutions, Harvard's Rare Book Collection from 1992 to 1995, and the Library of Congress from 1995 until the present. He has been a rare book curator, cataloger, web director, communications director, and he's currently a UX specialist with the Library of Congress's Design Directorate. From 1998 to 2013, in his spare time, he ran a successful digital arts consultancy in London. He has lectured extensively in North America and Europe and has worked with national libraries from 6 continents. John, we welcome your presentation.
Thanks very much. Let's share the screen here. My presentation today is called Becoming a UX Houdini. In the world of magic, there is perhaps no more famous performer than Harry Houdini. In September 1907, the San Francisco Call proclaimed that Houdini, a Leonardo da Vinci of the vaudeville circuit with several hundred professions in his fingers and toes and who can break jail with impunity, is a real hero. Decades have passed, and yet his name is still synonymous with the miraculous. He freed himself from ropes, shackles, and chains. No lock could hold him. Squeeze him into a milk can. Hang him upside down in a straitjacket, in a tank of water, no less. No air, fully visible to his audience. And every time he escaped. Most celebrities of a century ago have been forgotten, but today the name Houdini still evokes praise that is undeniably breathless. I work at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., And the library has a wealth of Houdini materials, including photos, prints, posters, recordings, and manuscripts. Houdini is of interest not just for the feats he performed on stages around the world, but how he got there. As a boy, he immigrated from Hungary to the United States. In 1886, years before he took the stage name Harry Houdini, 12-year-old Erich Weiss set out by boxcar, hoping to earn enough money to lift his family out of poverty. Perhaps his status as an immigrant contributed, as it so often does, to his ambitious spirit as an innovator, to use the outsider's perspective to discern truths about a situation others might miss. How does one capture the attention of an audience? When an action takes place, where does the eye go? What is predictable about a person's focus? Once those things are understood, how can an experience be devised and fine-tuned that will maximize the odds of a standing ovation? As UX professionals, this is, of course, what we do every day. You have a knack for seeing things that have been engineered toward optimization that others might miss. Here in Washington, D.C., the subway system typically has more escalators going up than down. That's because each time the trains enter the station, they unload hundreds of passengers in a matter of seconds, creating denser quantities of people exiting than it would ever have entering. It really is a kind of magic, so no wonder someone like Houdini would be a patron saint of UXers. To further attach him to our profession, I'll point out something else. Once he had achieved worldwide fame, he used his visibility and influence to expose sham spiritualists. They were abundant at the time, the spammers, scammers, and fishers of their day, holding faked seances and swindling people out of their money. Houdini was insistent that it be known his seemingly impossible feats were in no way enabled by the dark arts or sorcery. He wasn't getting help from intangible forces in the great beyond. Instead, he was employing quantifiable methodologies of understanding, manipulating operations and perceptions in the physical world, creating magic with a reliability that one might call scientific. Likewise, we UXers work in a world that often relegates art and design to the unscientific space of personal taste. How delightful, then, for our spokesperson Harry to campaign for the tangible, the quantifiable. Call it magic if you like, but beneath the wonder, it's observable human behavior making it happen. And so, having established Houdini as a role model for our discipline, I want to invoke his spirit, to draw on the lessons of his performances in order to help us address some of the less pleasant aspects of our work. I'm talking about problem projects. The ones where your sixth sense is tingling before you've even finished reading the charter, and you've instinctively put on your risk mitigation cap well before the first stand-up. And as UX professionals in government, perhaps you experience times when just the fact that you're in the public rather than the private sector seems to introduce obstacles every bit as constricting as locks, chains, and straitjackets. Bureaucracy and regulations, legacy systems, and increased scrutiny can all raise the stakes to Houdini-like levels, but take heart. Government workers are often the most dedicated, skilled, and nimble practitioners out there. Harry demonstrated that with those qualities. The impossible becomes possible as long as you step up and bring it. Lesson 1, shake hands with danger. Don't be put off by the tough project. Avoid recklessness, of course. Don't punch completely above your weight. But then again, you're in the ring because you know your stuff. And speaking of knowing your stuff, here's something that's forgotten about Houdini. He didn't start out as an escape artist. He began with traditional magic, as most magicians do. He was pretty good at it, too. That same 1907 newspaper called him a king of card tricksters and a Lincoln Steffens of prestidigitation, comparing him to the pioneering political reformer. But card tricks didn't make him famous, so he meditated on what would. Where does the eye go? How do you capture an audience? Which experience will bring the standing O? In Harry's case, the audience wanted danger. He didn't cower from it, nor did he launch himself at it Leroy Jenkins style. He calmly extended his hand and gave a firm shake. Here's an example from real life, from the halls of the Library of Congress. For the last year and a half, I've been the UX specialist on a little engine that could project called Stacks. The Library of Congress has been in the business of digital libraries since the 1990s, providing free access to tens of millions of items to anyone with an internet connection. Stacks, though, is a digital library with a difference. It's a space for rights-restricted material that can only be viewed on machines within the Library of Congress campus, including remote workers on the LOC network. Rights-restricted materials include books, newspapers, and journals that are submitted to the library in a digital form for copyright. In some cases, there are requirements written into copyright law that dictate restrictions on use. Those restrictions might say that a single item can have no more than 2 simultaneous users. Users might be able to print paper copies, but not download them. And as mentioned, make it available only within LOC spaces. I hesitate to talk about stacks right now, having set the stage for a problem project. In our case, the charter was excellent. The assembled team, though maybe a bit small, was highly skilled and eager to work together. The material to be included was diverse and interesting, and the project had the blessing of top leadership at the library. So what made it challenging? The timeline. Quite short for a project of its size, especially considering the number of unconventional requirements, including finite simultaneous users and print no download. In a way, it had the trappings of a Houdini spectacle. You'll be straitjacketed, chained, underwater, upside down, and various heads of state are going to be watching. We had challenges of constraint, time, and scrutiny, but we also saw the possibility of a standing ovation, both from patrons as well as colleagues. Guided by our project manager, cautious but undaunted, we stepped up and shook hands. And almost immediately, we encountered the second lesson to be taken from Houdini: foster the miraculous. In keeping with the greater vision of patron services at the Library of Congress, we employed a user-centered approach to the project. From the UX angle, we took the steps you'd expect: stakeholder interviews, persona building, cognitive walkthrough, heuristic evaluation. Likewise, our developers and subject matter experts were moving forward, and before long, we realized something surprising. The impossible afforded us unexpected benefits. The truncated timeline made for beautifully distraction-free collaboration. The pickiness of requirements created solidarity around the elegance of a minimum viable product. It was as though we were bringing an outsider's perspective to it and uncovering examples where others see obstacles, see escape, and acclaim where others see doom. Create and fine-tune an experience that capitalizes on the challenges that sent others running for the hills. Foster the miraculous. And what did the audience think when we launched? Well, libraries are stereotypically quiet places with a lot of shushing, but not at our demos. I can safely say that in my 25 years at LOC, I've never seen librarians this excited. It turns out that pretty much everyone has restricted view material that they've always wished could be available via digital delivery. Manuscripts, audio recordings, foreign language newspapers. The initial Stacks release has been followed by 2 major releases, and current development is underway to support audio and video. It is conceivable that one day Stacks could hold original copyright deposits of motion pictures, and if so, there may be some clamoring among scholars attached to the Han shot first argument. Lesson 3, very simple. Be Houdini. Use your training and curiosity to see what others don't. Be undaunted. High stakes can bring high fives. Cultivate the unexpected wins along the way. And debunk the belief that user experience is a seance pulling decisions out of midair. Abracadabra. And that is all.
Awesome. John, thank you so much. At the beginning of your presentation, somebody likened it to listening to a podcast, and I think you continue to pull us in with the rest of your time. So you're getting applause in the comments, and we welcome your questions in the comments as well. I haven't seen a specific question yet, but continued praise. Someone commenting that storytelling is so effective, and I would say that even in your presentation, like your method of telling the story definitely adds to what you had to add. So praise is continuing to pour in. Great story, great job, very pleasant voice, absolutely. And So somebody has the question of if it's recorded. Yes, these sessions are being recorded and they'll be made available as soon as possible. So Kimberly is wondering, John, what was the biggest challenge that you faced and how did you solve it?
I would say that it was the timeline. And we were inspired by the fact that what we were doing was meeting the universal goal of libraries, and that is to make materials available to patrons. And what had happened was the library had been receiving born digital mandatory copyright deposits of newspapers, and they were accumulating, and we had no way of presenting them to anyone. So it was an important project, but as with any large institution, there are a lot of important projects. And a decision was made that a fast timeline could probably really grease the wheels and make something happen. When we started, there was an immediate sort of head scratching about the timeline. It really was just, I'm trying to remember, like between 3 and 6 months. And we just banded together and it was an amazing team. Everyone worked together beautifully. And when we were about 3 months into it, we realized, wow, we're actually going to be able to create something important and the ripple effect is going to be profound.
Here's your lightning round question, and that is if you could talk about a specific instance when you were able to shift someone's mind on UX being magic. This is the 30 seconds or less answer.
Absolutely. My first big UX experience was doing a major site redesign for an intranet. And it was for a research organization populated by people who were tops in their field worldwide. So everyone had an opinion, and it was hard to make anything change. By taking a user experience approach and having quantifiable data to back up all of the decision-making on the redesign, as well as having pulled in, I think we had 40% of the overall staff contribute to the different exercises. At the end, when we launched and we had the same 30 people who complain about lots of things say, why did this happen? This is all wrong. We were able to instead point to data and say, this is why we did it. And we can back it up with more data if you need.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you, John. As I noted earlier, the sessions are being recorded and they will be available as soon as possible. So our next presenter is Angela Smithers, and she is a user experience designer at Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Previously, she was one of a number of volunteers on the UN Sustainable Development Goals National Reporting Platform for the US with the team at GSA. Her fields of design range from architecture and interior design to graphic and web design. Her passion for both people and design has led the field of user experience and accessibility. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you. I'll start with sharing my screen. Okay. As soon as the host allows the screen sharing, I can choose the option to share screen.
Can you try again, Angela?
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Are you able to see a little too much?
I think I saw a slideshow option there.
Yeah, I went to the advanced option to share a portion, and that option has been removed. So, okay. 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 So this is UX via dot voting, a story of a novice approach to intercept testing. And welcome everyone. So once upon a time in an agency not so far away at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a UX designer, that's me, and a digital content producer set out to make something better. Usually at agencies that I've worked for, we are setting out to make something better as opposed to making something from scratch. And what were our challenges? We had, as John Poole mentioned, a short time frame in which to deliver results. We wanted to hear the voice of the user as opposed to the voice of stakeholders or our own experiences speaking to the design. And we wanted to make sure that we did not push out any deadlines or kind of go beyond our timeline when seeking the voice of the user. We had a budget of $0, and we had never done this before. So like John Poole said beautifully, we were shaking hands with danger. So lights, camera, action. We used a method that I will, for the sake of memorizing it, I will call BLISS, which I've abbreviated as breathe, listen, integrate, simplify, and share. So B being breathe, L is listen to advice from other industry experts. I is integrate improved methods with which you are familiar. And S is simplify, answer only one question if possible. We had tons of things that we could have approached the user about, but being such a short time frame and the fact that this was very ad hoc for us, we limited it to one question, one design question. And then the final S is share. So breathe, don't panic. That might be the first inclination is I've got this spur of the moment need for user input and I need some sort of organized methodology in order to collect quantitative or qualitative data. But using the method of listening to other experts, especially via listserv, specifically UX COP, I did reach out to other experts and I heard back from some very nice people who were open to share ideas with me at both FAA and at another agency right across the street from me, as a matter of fact. So as they advised, I integrated a method that I was familiar with, which in this case for this presentation was dot voting. I had participated in dot voting at other design sessions, design challenges, and even in a university setting at University of Maryland. Dot voting according to 18F. F comprises of these 7 steps on how to do it. Is what we had to do. So taking a proven method and modifying it for our sake, we took these 5 steps out of the 7 steps that were suggested. So 1, we printed the proposed interfaces that were in question. 2, we brought plenty of sticky adhesive dots to the site where we were conducting our intercept testing. 3, we positioned ourselves in an area, a high traffic area, where our audience would be available to us for questioning, for approaching, for even doing a little bit of interviewing. Step 4, we asked the museum visitors to select their favorite web interface by placing 1 sticky dot on the back of the paper printout of the interface. We chose to do the back because we were trying to maintain kind of that absence of peer pressure. We didn't want them to be influenced by the decisions that previous voters or participants had made. And like psychology has proven, we tend to want that affirmation with our decision by going with a group or a crowd or what the majority has already decided. So putting the dot on the back as opposed to the front where it could be plainly visible was an important, very important step to our methodology. And then 5, we identified the interface design with the most votes. So our surprising outcome, when we asked our 1 question, they answered. And we were pleasantly surprised that they were willing to participate. When we first went there, we were very nervous and very apprehensive as to whether or not we would get anyone to respond to our 1 question. And many people answered. So we went there with the hopes of getting 5, 7, 10 people to respond. They were happy to answer, which was also a surprise. We weren't that annoying person in the mall that grabs you with a clipboard and wants 30 minutes of your time. So we were pleasantly surprised by that. And not only that, but 75 people answered our 1 question within the little bit of time that we spent in the museum, which was less than 3 or 4 hours. So sharing the result, it turned out that we were right about our initial thoughts on the design for the interface. But more importantly than being right or wrong, we had quantified the user experience in a way that we could present to stakeholders and developers so that they could understand. It was more than just the typical, here's what research has shown, here's what other websites are doing. It was, here's the voice of the user has spoken, and we have the user's voice in high quantities and the numbers that are undeniable. So with that in mind, we shared with stakeholders, management, developers, and not only that, but internally within Smithsonian, using the platform that we have to share documents and research internally, so that anybody who's looking for a suggestion on what to do and what they can do quickly, they're able to pull up the report and the results of what we had done. And now we are sharing with you. So some of you may be familiar with the Thomas Kilmann model for arguments. There's assertiveness versus cooperativeness. And where we were at the time before beginning the dot voting was at a point or a crossroad where we could possibly compromise. And we didn't want to sacrifice the voice of the user for internal compromises and trade-offs. We wanted to get to a point where we were collaborating both with the user and with each other. So we moved from a place of compromise to collaboration, which allowed us to build a stronger design. And the final winning interface, according to the user, was what you see before you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angela. We do have one question, which is, when you said quantified, how big was your sample?
We had a total of 75 dot votes that resulted in a matter of, I want to say, no more than 4 hours. I think we might have spent 3 hours there. But as far as the quantity of people to select from that walked through the area of the museum where we were stationed, we didn't do like a click number to see what our potential was. I know that thousands of people move through each Smithsonian museum in a day. So we had high hopes for catching at least 10 or 15 of them. So yeah, 75 ended up being the total number of votes.
That is awesome. Always better to get more people than less people, right? Great. And another question is, and this will be our lightning round question for you. How do you deal with management approval to do an informal user study without paperwork burden, approval, etc.?
Okay, so for that, we wanted to go by the book at first, but it turned out we approached our internal review board, and because we weren't taking any PII, we didn't need the IRB's approval to do ad hoc research using this particular method. And then we wanted also permission just in writing, but because we weren't doing any PII collection and we weren't, doing any photographs or that sort of thing, management was like, everything you're doing so far is fine and we don't see a need for a sign off. I know safety came to the museum to make sure that they signed off on our location being safe for both us and for possible, I want to say, fire escape, in case an alarm was pulled or something like that. But that's the extent of our red tape that we had to go through.
Great, thank you so much. So with that, we'll transition to our next speaker, who is Dr. Anthony Schultzenberg. And he earned his PhD from the University of Minnesota in educational psychology and is currently a usability researcher working in the Human Factors and Usability Group in the Census Bureau's Center for Behavioral Science Methods. There, he conducts UX research and evaluations for internal and external clients on paper, web, and mobile class platforms.
All right, thank you, Suzanne. So I'm presenting a collaborative effort with my colleagues on developing a formula to calculate severity scores in multitask usability testing. So first I'll touch on why severity scores are important and useful in UX research, and then discuss how they're currently being produced. Next, I'll introduce the proposed formula, use a real usability test to illustrate how it works, and then wrap up with limitations and advantages.
Hey, Anthony, before you get started, could you enter into full screen mode for us, please?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I appreciate it. Is that better?
I think it's the same. If you go to the third icon, if you see comments at the bottom and then to the right, yeah, exactly. Use slideshow there at the top, perhaps?
It's not allowing me to share my second monitor. That's the problem.
You just need to switch displays once you go into slide. So go into the slideshow and then you'll see an option for switch displays at the top left. If you go into the slideshow first, there you go. And then you see at the top left, swap displays.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry for that. Okay, so part of user experience research is testing the system's usability. The tests usually require users to complete tasks while researchers document their user behavior, attitudes, and reactions. So the purpose of usability tests is usually to evaluate the system and identify problems that negatively impact the user's ability to complete a task. So oftentimes, usability problems identified exceed the resources available to address all of them. And therefore, researchers can help designers and developers prioritize which problems should be addressed. Severity scores provide a means of prioritizing usability problems and guide limited resource allocation. So the ways researchers provide prioritization falls mainly into two camps. The first being judgment-driven. This method relies on the experience and intuition of the researcher to rate usability problems they believe should be given priority. The second way to prioritize usability problems is to use data. This can be done by assigning a category such as high, medium, or low, or a number to the problem using a pre-established criteria. While there's a lot of variation as to what data sources are used to determine the usability problems, prioritization, some examples include frequency of occurrence, impact on task performance, ease of correction, and timing. So both current prioritization methods have several shortcomings. Researchers have found that judgment-driven priorities are inconsistent across researchers and tests. Others have found that data-driven and judgment-driven method scores often do not match. Information on the users affected and what behavior really caused the behavior is lost. And furthermore, the type of prioritization that is likely not as persuasive to stakeholders as ones that use data. So data-driven methods also have their limitations. Some well-respected formulas do not accommodate usability tests that include multiple tasks. Furthermore, some metrics used to determine severity, such as impact on performance, are not always operationalized and are left up to subjectivity. So because most of these methods also involve some level of subjectivity, it's resulted in weak correlations of scores between researchers. And like judgment-driven methods, data-driven methods can also result in a loss of information depending on the formula being used. And lastly, the use of data-driven methods is inconsistent across researchers and has really left the field kind of uncertain as to what methods should be used or adopted for different types of usability evaluations. So in efforts to address some of these shortcomings, we were inspired by a data-driven method by Hertzum that introduced a severity score formula that presents the severity of each usability problem as a % of the severity sum, which is akin to R-squared in regression analysis. So in this way, we could see the impact of each problem relative to all the problems identified. For example, when talking about the severity of a usability problems he identified, Hertzum states, on average, half of the severity sum is constrained in the first 22% of all the problems. We believe this type of information is especially valuable when communicating results to stakeholders. Unfortunately, Hertzum's formula is not compatible for multitask usability evaluations. So to address this gap, we propose the Multitask Usability Severity Score method, or MUTS. With this formula, we aim to provide a reliable and meaningful measure of relative impact of the usability problem on the system within multitask usability evaluations. And moreover, this method can provide the development team convincing evidence of usability problems and their toll on the system, as well as a tool to quantify their efforts that they're working on when they're addressing usability issues. So to calculate the severity score of the usability problem, MUTS utilizes a weighted average of the % of users who experienced the problem and could not complete the task, or %C, and the percent of users who experienced the task and were delayed in completing the task, or %D. Here, instances that are related to task failure are upweighted, and instances related to increased time, but still task completion, are downweighted. So scores range between 1 and 100, and using effectiveness and efficiency as criteria for the formulation allows for less subjectivity and improved interpretability. And moreover, within multitask usability tests, sometimes usability problem can lead to task failure, and sometimes it can lead to task delay for the same user across the test. The MUTS, unlike previous formulas, accounts for these nuances because users can be counted in both task failure and task delay. So perhaps the best way to illustrate this is through an example. So imagine we had 4 users participate in a 4-task usability test. From the results, we identified 2 usability problems. We then code which users experienced each problem and if it coincided with the inability to complete the task or just a delay in completion. We see from the usability problem 1, 2 out of 4 or 50% of users who experienced that problem on the task couldn't complete the task. And 2 out of 4 who experienced the problem were only delayed in completion. For usability problem 2, we see 4 out of 4 or 100% of the users were unable to complete the task, and 3 out of 4 or 75% were delayed. So this gives us %C and %D. Next, the percentages are weighted and then averaged. This results in severity score of a single usability problem and is repeated for each problem. So in this example, we have severity scores of 50 for usability problem 1 and 93.75 for usability problem 2. So these severity scores can be informative in and of themselves, but the percent of the total problem that it accounts for tells an even more compelling story. For example, in this usability test that found 10 problems, we can see the relative impact of each problem across the entire test. So using the table and pie chart, we can clearly see that if developers were to address the 3 largest problems, they could lower the total severity score by over 50%, thus reducing the identified toll in the system by half. Therefore, not only does this provide a severity score for each usability problem, it also helps visualize how much each problem impacts the system relative to all the problems that were found. So we applied this method to a usability evaluation on the Census Bureau's data website, data.census.gov. So a sample of 19 users from the DC metro region completed 7 to 11 tasks depending on their experience levels. We identified 34 usability problems from bottom-up analyses, but when we applied the MUTS method to the data, we saw that 6 problems with the largest severity scores accounted for over 50% of the total severity. So in doing this, we narrowed down what problems developers can tackle for the most bang for their buck. The visualization helps communicate the impact of addressing just the most severe problems. We can see that many problems we found were not that impactful relative to others, and therefore priority should be given to the problems that account for the largest amount of severity, or the biggest pieces of the pie. So there are a few limitations to this method that should be noted. First, our formula is not intended for use with usability tests that only have 1 task. And furthermore, the severity scores produced do not provide information of the impact of usability problem on a specific task. Also, the formula is insensitive to the length of delay because all the delays are treated the same. And lastly, this process likely requires more time than judgment-driven prioritization because researchers must first identify all usability problems and then tabulate the occurrences among users. So to help make this process a little more timely, we have created an Excel worksheet in our code for anyone that will produce the tables and graphs that we presented here. So altogether, the MUTS methods has many advantages over data-driven prioritization methods. First, it takes into account multiple tasks, allowing for an accurate depiction of user experiences. Second, it reduces subjectivity and improves reliability across iterations of testing and between testers. Third, it treats problems that coincide with task failure more severe than delaying completion. And the MUTS methods provides a calculation of the relative proportion of the total severity for each usability problem, which really helps aid in the interpretation when looking at the entire test. Reliable scores and meaningful proportion calculations allow stakeholders to quantify their efforts in the design team as they tackle the usability problems. And finally, our Excel worksheets and our code can help save time and do the calculations for you. So in conclusion, we believe that usability problem prioritization should be less of a gut measure and use more objective standardized methods. By using weighted effectiveness and efficiency as measures, our proposed formula can help usability researchers produce more reliable and meaningful severity scores. And then lastly, we believe that reporting relative burden for each usability problem can improve the utility of the severity scores and aid in communicating the results to stakeholders. So thanks for your time. If you want the Excel worksheet or R code, please email me and I'll share it free of cost, of course. So I'll take any questions or comments now.
Awesome, Anthony, thank you so much. We're going to keep going so that Margot has a good time for her presentation. And I would invite you to drop your email address into the chat so that people can have it from there. And then if we have time at the end, we'll go back and gather up the questions. So moving on to Margot. Margot Cable is a user experience analyst in the Veterans Health Administration. She is the pharmacy engagement lead in the Division of Human Factors Engineering, and her projects include evaluations of medical systems, such as electronic health records, and web and mobile-based products for both clinical staff and veterans. Margot, we look forward to your presentation.
Hey, thanks a lot, Suzanne. First, a shout out to the organizers for setting this up as a virtual summit. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. Let's see, let me just jump right into it. I've got a little agenda here. This is what we're going to cover, sort of introduction on the problem of the lost socks, human-centered design and agile, our requirements checklist, and some summary and takeaways. So here we are. Let's start with talking about what is the lost sock problem. I think you know what it is, but let's just say it's when you toss 3 pairs of socks in the laundry basket, but only find 2 in the dryer. And maybe the other ones are stuck to a t-shirt or on the floor by the washer. But the point is, without some vigilance, requirements are like socks that can go astray during product development. So I'm going to talk about a way to address that problem. And those of you who've already abandoned socks, given the weather, just bear with me on this one. I wrote this when it was colder outside. So my experience with the lost sock problem phenomenon is in the context of implementing medication information standards across VHA, Veterans Health. The standards are part of a policy called Essential Med Directive. This directive addresses adverse events associated with inaccurate and incomplete medication lists and also confusing pharmacy terms. It sets some standards for the kind of information that's presented to staff and patients, and it has a really broad scope. It impacts all applications that include meds, allergies, adverse drug reactions, and prescriptions. It also takes a user-centric approach, which explains my involvement. So here's a little example. Here is the image of a prescription label from a VA medication. The standards are at work here, and you'll probably see this on your own prescription labels. Ibuprofen, 400 milligrams tab. At the VA, the standards dictate that VA only uses generic names. You have a units, which is 400. You have a measurement, a strength, 400. You have units, and then you have a form, which is tablet, abbreviated here, just by way of understanding a little bit about what this is about. So the problems. Providing standards for consistent data and understandable language is really critical for safe and effective health IT products. But what we found out was the granular and iterative nature of Agile software development makes it really easy to lose track of components of policy standards and requirements in general without some vigilance. And that was me trying to channel Alistair Moody there. So we follow a human-centered design process based on the ISO standards, and in our office, Human Factors Engineering, we work with business owners often to specify requirements for these kinds of projects. So VA also follows Agile processes where requirements are collected and turned into user stories. So an example of a user story is, as a veteran, I want to see a list of all my medications so that I can manage my medications at home. So these user stories are prioritized and stored in a product backlog. And as a result, user stories can become separated from their original context. Here's a bigger picture of the process with human-centered design as bookends to the Agile process. I can just focus on the diagram at the top. The callouts are details you can look at later. So some context, as we said, can be lost just in moving from, you know, call out number 1 to call out number 3 in this product backlog. Then you have sprint planning. You have a sprint backlog that is pulled from the product backlog. You know, people actually write code. You have meetings to review it. You create an increment of code for some part of this functionality for this product. Over time, these increments are collected. And here's the important part. The product sponsor wants to release what's been developed, but as a subject matter expert whose role is making sure there's full compliance, you need to find all your requirement socks. Are they in the laundry basket of collected increments? We can hope. Often that's not the case though. For example, you know, maybe the dev team included the medication name and the strength, but not the units. So maybe the medication display just said ibuprofen 400 tablets. So you can imagine that might be a problem. That could be easily misinterpreted. So given the known lossiness potential of user stories, we found it's best to evaluate against requirements and not the user stories. That leads us to the next thing. How do you do that? Enter the checklist. This is a spreadsheet. Anyone can make this. This is a detail view where we've listed each requirement in column 1 with detailed guidance. And then we have options to enter yes, no, or partial, not evaluated in the second column. And the third column has comments to explain whatever you put in the second column, and then we capture screenshots. So we work through, our particular guidance has 18 elements. So we work through all of those, complete these details views. And then we have a summary view. It's a nice snapshot of the state of compliance. You know, you can use this throughout the software development cycle and see progress over time. Well, hopefully, this is what we hope for. So, you know, we track the business owner information, and then we have totals for each one of the possible statuses of each one of these elements. And then, as you can see with version numbers, we have pages set up so that we can track all of those over time. So now let's go back to the HCD and Agile process diagram. Now with the checklist added, you can see it over there on the far right-hand side. You have a much better idea of what requirement socks are actually completed, and missing items like the units for, you know, the medication strength can be easily identified and put back into the process. So here we are over here. You've gone through your checklist, you've come back to the business owners and said, here's the things we've got, here's the things we are missing. Can we find them back in the process? We can send them back in, put them back through the laundry again, and have some confidence that we'll know when they come through there or not. So in summary, providing standards for consistent data and understandable language is critical for safe and effective health IT products. However, this granular nature of Agile really throws a wrench in our attempts to keep track of all of those things. So this is our solution. Having lost many SOCs in the past, we're now going back to evaluating against requirements and not the user stories, conducting iterative evaluations using a checklist of defined standards or requirements. And this provides quick feedback to the team with a visual summary of the degree. It tells them where they are. You've got a snapshot and you know. Takeaways really helps me keep track of all of these small but tiny, really important pieces of requirements. As you can see, pharmacy requirements, I would describe as details on top of details. These checklists can be used to evaluate just about anything really. Enterprise, something you're thinking about acquiring, and you can use them to evaluate products as they're developed over time. But more specifically in our case, it's increased the consistency of med information across all of our VHA products. And this increases usability, patient safety, and reduces cognitive burden on users. So I've got references. I've got a question. How many socks did I start with? What color were my socks?
Hey, Margot, thank you so much. So a question that we've gotten is, how are you representing requirements in acceptance criteria and user stories? Do you refer back to the checklist, or does each user story have its own acceptance criteria?
The user stories have acceptance criteria. We try to make those pretty detailed so that all of the requirements are covered, but sometimes they just, because they just don't, they get interpreted differently, and parts tend to fall through the cracks. And it may be a function of pharmacy that has just so many detailed components that it's especially problematic. But that's why I've started going back to the requirements, the actual requirements in this case, just to make sure we have an end-to-end check.
Awesome, thanks. So let us come back to a question for Anthony, and I'm going to combine two of them. So one is, with an N less than 30, is it really worth being this rigorous with your statistics? It seems like a Likert scale sum would be just about as valid and as simpler to calculate. And then a similar question to that is, what do you do in cases where you have only 1 or 2 users that you're allowed to test?
Yeah, so we're not claiming any sort of significance. So of course, usability test is going to have a small sample. So we're what this is really, where this benefits the researcher is the weighting and putting different emphasis on either task completion or task delay. So a Likert scale wouldn't really capture that. And so by looking across that, weighting it, and also giving those percentages is where we argue that this would be more convincing to stakeholders. And if you only have 1 or 2 users, I mean, one might be, you might not see much. The number of users isn't limited, but it's more the tasks. So if you have a lot of tasks, you can gather more data. That would be more useful and probably be a little more representative in the output.
Great, thank you. So thank you to John and Angela, Anthony, and Margot. And Jean, take us out of the session. And remember that there's another one this afternoon to come back to.
I just want to thank the presenters. This was a really awesome session this morning, a great way to kick off the summit. As Susanne said, there are 5 more sessions to the summit, and you just see in the chat links to register if you haven't already. And I look forward to seeing everyone or the future sessions, so please join us. Thanks very much.